Okay, I see a request for interpretation. Luckily, I am born and raised in Florida, so I am used to consecutive translation. So that is not a problem for me to run my presentation that way. I will pause to allow interpretation.
Miss Jones ha notado que la señora Alvarado o señorita Alvarado está pidiendo interpretación al español y tengo entendido que Miss Jones tiene un trasfondo de Florida. That's where I am right now. I live in Central Florida, Miss Jones. So vamos a tener más ventaja de la interpretación consecutiva. Miss Jones dice unas cuantas frases y yo la interpreto al español, ¿ok?
All right. So my presentation is on supported decision-making for people with disabilities, specifically as an alternative to guardianship.
Mi presentación es respecto a hacer decisiones apoyadas para las personas que tienen discapacidades en términos de personas con discapacidades.
Trying to get there we go. I am a staff attorney with Disability Rights Maryland, and I wanted to state off the bat, this presentation is to provide basic information specific to Maryland residents, and it doesn't contain legal advice.
Soy licenciada de la organización Disability Rights Maryland y esta presentación provee información básica respecto a lo que el contexto de esta presentación para los residentes del estado de Maryland y no contiene ningunos consejos legales.
Disability Rights Maryland is what's called a protection and advocacy agency. We are federally mandated to advance the rights of people with disabilities across the state.
Esta organización Disability Rights Maryland es una organización designada por el gobierno federal para protección y apoyo, con la orden de promover los derechos de las personas a través de discapacidades donde ellos residan.
We provide free legal services to people with disabilities on a wide range of issues. I like to say we cover birth through life issues for individuals with disabilities.
Proveemos servicios legales gratuitos a personas con discapacidades en un rango amplio de asuntos, desde nacimiento a través de toda la vida.
And I mentioned this presentation is not legal advice, but if you want specific legal advice, you can contact Disability Rights Maryland, and our contact information will be provided at the end of the presentation.
Como dije anteriormente, esta charla no provee ningún consejo legal, pero si estás interesada en examinar sus derechos legales, por favor contacte a Disability Rights Maryland. La información de punto de contacto va a ser provista brevemente.
And one thing I want to mention specifically, because this presentation is about empowering individuals with disabilities to make their own decisions, is that we advocate and engage in our legal work alongside people with disabilities. So we want to partner with, we want to include, and there's a saying, nothing about us without us, that is very important to our work.
Como estamos explorando apoyos para tomar decisiones respecto a las personas con discapacidades o incapacidades en los aspectos legales, esto es un trabajo de consorcio, de compañerismo. Lo hacemos juntos, trabajando juntos.
So as an overview of this presentation, I want to lay the foundation and explain some terms that I'll be using.
En términos de grandes rasgos, esta charla respecto a establecer los fundamentos, explicar algunos términos que vamos a estar usando.
I'll talk about supported decision-making specifically in Maryland.
Apoyando decisiones específicamente para el estado de Maryland.
I'll talk about why supported decision-making is important.
¿Por qué es importante tomar estas decisiones con apoyo?
And I'll share resources.
Y después comparto recursos disponibles al final de esta charla.
So first, laying the foundation.
Estableciendo el fundamento, la fundación.
I want to define the word capacity for this presentation.
Quiero definir la palabra capacidad en esta charla.
So for purposes of today, capacity is going to refer to an individual's ability to understand, make, and communicate a decision.
Capacidad en este contexto significa la habilidad de una persona entender, tomar y comunicar una decisión. Entender, tomar y comunicar una decisión.
We're talking about a person's decision-making ability or their ability to indicate what their preference is and then act on that preference.
Capacidad implica la habilidad de tomar decisiones, indicar una preferencia por estos individuos o estos individuos y actuar en esta decisión tomada.
And my slide has an image with 3 bubbles on like a timeline.
Vemos en pantalla como 3 burbujas azules, como si fuera un calendario de tiempo.
And the reason for this graphic is that decision making we can view it as a spectrum.
La razón de esta gráfica es que veamos tomar decisiones como un espectro a través del tiempo.
And what I mean by that is that depending on the context or the type of decision the person is making, the time in their life, other factors, their ability to make a decision with support or without support can vary.
En términos del tipo de decisión, el tiempo que tenemos y otros factores afecta la capacidad del individuo de tomar decisiones.
And one thing I want to point out about this specific graphic is that the spectrum goes from needing less support to needing more support. There's no needing no support on here.
En esta gráfica no hay lugar para no apoyo. La parte izquierda en pantalla, menos apoyo. La parte derecha en pantalla dice needs more support, que necesitamos más apoyo. No hay un área donde haya cero apoyo.
And why I want to draw attention to that is that the basis of this idea of supported decision making is that none of us are making decisions completely alone.
El contexto de esto, o la base de esto, que ninguna persona está tomando decisiones por sí mismo o misma.
And oftentimes when we're thinking about decision making, we can look at it as if a person needs support, or if a person has a disability, we can look at their need for support as somehow detrimental or different, or a reason to put in place a more restrictive type of protection, like a guardianship.
Veamos en términos de esta dimensión de tomar decisiones como una persona que necesita más apoyo, tiene una discapacidad, que una persona diferente, que tal vez que haya que intervenir para tomar decisiones en vez de esta persona, que necesite más apoyo. Es la manera en que a veces vemos este tipo de decisiones de personas con discapacidades.
But in reality, none of us make decisions completely by ourselves. We all rely on support.
Ninguno de nosotros como individuos tomamos decisiones por nosotros mismos. Siempre buscamos apoyo a través de nosotros, a nuestro alrededor para tomar decisiones.
And so we want to challenge that idea that only people with disabilities need support, or that needing support is in any way an indication that a person shouldn't be able to make their own decisions.
En términos de discapacidad, que no pensemos que esta persona por esta discapacidad automáticamente necesita apoyo. Todas las personas cuando tomamos decisiones necesitamos apoyo.
And that's true. You know, I am a lawyer. I make my own decisions at the end of the day, but I don't do that without support from my husband, my family, my friends. And that should not be a reason that a person with a disability can't be able to needing that support shouldn't be a reason a person with a disability can't make their own decisions.
Yo como abogado, licenciada, tomo mis propias decisiones, pero dependo de mi esposo, dependo de mi familia, dependo de mis amistades como una fuente de apoyo para ayudarme a tomar mejores decisiones. Eso implica que nosotros, todos los seres humanos, necesitamos tomar decisiones con apoyo de otras personas que nos rodean, que nos aman.
Sorry, waiting for the animation to let me move on to the next slide.
Of course.
Okay, so that was capacity. Legal capacity is a principle that determines what decisions a person can make under law.
Anteriormente hablamos de capacidad. Ahora el término está juntado con la palabra legal. Esta es la capacidad legal. Esto es un principio legal que determina qué decisiones una persona puede hacer bajo las leyes.
And some examples of that can be providing consent or making a contract.
Dos ejemplos incluyen proveyendo consentimiento, autorización, estableciendo un contrato.
So capacity is the ability to make a decision and communicate it. Legal capacity is the legal decisions that a person is deemed to be able to make.
Recordemos que en términos de capacidad de decidir y comunicar, ahora con el contexto legal, estamos haciendo una decisión legal que tiene más peso en términos de el propósito de esta decisión.
Under the law, everyone is presumed to have legal capacity.
Bajo la ley, todas las personas se presumen que tienen una capacidad legal.
And if a person has legal capacity, then their decisions are recognized under the law.
Y si una persona tiene una capacidad legal, sus decisiones se reconocen bajo la ley.
And an important factor here is that a person can have legal capacity to make some decisions, but not other decisions.
Algo importante recordar, una persona que no tenga una capacidad, tal vez no tenga una capacidad legal para ciertas decisiones, que tenga, I stand corrected, que tenga la capacidad de hacer ciertas decisiones, pero no otras. O sea, podemos establecer una diferencia en las decisiones legales que esta persona puede hacer. Unas sí, otras no.
So for example, a person might be able to make decisions about their person, but not about their finances. You can have capacity in some areas, but not others.
En términos de capacidad legal, por ejemplo, una persona puede tomar decisiones respecto a su persona, a sí mismo, pero el término financiero, las finanzas, las obligaciones legales financieras, tal vez esta persona no tenga capacidad legal de tomar decisiones.
And it's up to a court to decide.
Y un tribunal tiene que decidir qué capacidades legales este individuo tiene.
Now, guardianship is something that an individual is susceptible to if they don't have legal capacity to make a decision.
I'm going to use, Ms. Jones, I'm going to use the term tutela o tutoría. Is that correct? For guardianship.
I don't know.
Okay. Take me by faith. I think I can establish the difference in terms of what guardianship is. Le estaba pidiendo permiso a la licenciada para usar el término tutela o tutoría. Esto es un aspecto que define respecto a ciertas posibilidades de tomar decisiones. Una tutoría o tutela. Thank you.
In Maryland, there are two types of guardianship: guardianship of the person and guardianship of the property.
En el estado de Maryland hay dos programas o categorías de tutoría o tutela: persona y propiedad.
If a person is under guardianship, they lose the legal authority to make their decisions by themselves.
Si una persona está bajo tutoría legal, esta persona pierde la capacidad legal de tomar decisiones.
And this substitute decision making allows their guardian to act for that person.
Y esta sustitución le permite legalmente a este tutor que provee los servicios de tutela de tomar las decisiones de otra persona que no puede tomar decisiones legales.
And as I mentioned previously, the guardianship is overseen by a court, and it's a judicial process that requires the involvement of an attorney.
Este proceso envuelve un licenciado, un abogado, para trabajar con la tribunal o las cortes para los servicios de tutela o tutoría.
So for a guardianship of the person, the standard is that a person needs to lack the understanding or capacity to make or communicate responsible decisions about his or her person. So that's healthcare, food, clothing, or shelter. I'm not hearing the interpreter. Does anyone else?
We have figured out how to change it so he is doing it simultaneously. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, so do I just roll through the presentation now?
Yes, please.
Perfect. Okay, so For guardianship of the person, as I was saying, a person needs to lack the understanding or capacity to make or communicate responsible decisions about healthcare, food, clothing, or shelter, things related to their person. And this must be due to their disability. And the important thing here is that there must be no less restrictive alternatives available. And what we'll talk about at the end of this presentation is supported decision-making as a less restrictive alternative. For guardian of the property, again, it has to be due to the person's disability, and the person must be unable to manage their property and affairs effectively, and they must be entitled to property or benefits that need management. And so these are not light considerations. And as I mentioned on the last slide, they are two separate considerations, two separate standards, and you can have capacity in one area, legal capacity, and lack legal capacity in the other area. So some alternatives to guardianship, in general, consent to exchange information. So HIPAA consents, FERPA consents, person-centered planning. That's a tool that I sometimes use with my transition-aged students in high school, and supported decision-making. And person-centered planning and supported decision-making as alternatives look at the network of support around the individual's interests, and how their network of supports can be used in order to assist them in making decisions, rather than in taking away their legal authority through guardianship to make those decisions themselves. There are also financial alternatives to guardianship. So a power of attorney, a special needs trust, a representative payee for Social Security funds, or an ABLE account. I believe I saw a presentation on ABLE accounts later, and they can provide more information about that. And then medical, individuals can do advanced medical directives, an advanced directive for mental health treatment, or surrogate decision-making. And some of these things are not limited to people with disabilities. So anyone can make an advanced medical directive or directive for mental health treatment, or a power of attorney. And so it's important when we're thinking about how to support a person with a disability that we think about these less restrictive alternatives that are available to help support them. Now, specifically supported decision-making. It's an alternative to guardianship that allows a person to keep their decision-making authority without appointing a specific substitute decision maker. The National Resource Center on Supported Decision-Making defines this as people who use trusted friends, family members, and professionals to help them understand the situations and choices they face, so they may make their own decisions. And it's a means for increasing self-determination by encouraging and empowering people to make their own decisions about their lives to the maximum extent possible. And as I was mentioning at the beginning, this is what we all do. We all rely on our network, no matter who we are, disability or no disability. We rely on our network of support to help us understand situations and make choices. And so when we're thinking about a person with a disability and their capacity, we should think about whether there's a network of support for them that can support them just as a network supports a non-disabled person. Supported decision-making is not substitute decision-making. And what that means is you are relying on the assistance of others to help yourself research and make decisions, but at the end of the day, the decision is yours. You haven't delegated the responsibility or the authority to make that decision to somebody else. It's not a power of attorney, so you're not appointing someone to act for you. You are keeping, the person with the disability, or are keeping the authority to actually make the decision, and you're surrounding yourself with support to help you research, weigh options, consider alternatives. But at the end of the day, you make the decision. And it's not shared decision making. So it's not making a consensus decision. It's truly that person is making the decision, but they're making it with support. Now, specifically in Maryland, supported decision making. Just by way of background, in 2020, Disability Rights Maryland began work on a Maryland cross-disability supported decision-making coalition with stakeholders from across the state representing advocates and organizations in both the aging and disability community. The coalition got technical assistance from the National Resource Center for Supported Decision-Making that I quoted on that last slide in order to create an action plan for implementing supported decision-making in Maryland. And one of the goals was to pass legislation and develop pilot projects along with educational and outreach resources. And as a result of that coalition, a bill passed this past legislative session, Senate Bill 559, recognizing supported decision-making in Maryland. That bill, Senate Bill 559, requires that supported decision-making be considered as a less restrictive alternative before a guardianship can be imposed. And supported decision-making can be used as a tool to prevent, limit, or end the use of a guardianship. It can prevent it if supported decision-making can be used in a less restrictive manner. It can end a guardianship if one was in place and it's determined that that person could effectively be supported with supported decision-making. Or it can limit a guardianship because, as I mentioned, you can have capacity in one area and lack in another. So maybe you can use supported decision-making to effectively make decisions about your person, but not your property, or vice versa. In Maryland, individuals can make supported decision-making agreements formally and written agreements that outline who is helping them, how they're helping, etc. Or they can have an informal agreement and just rely on their natural community of supports. Having an agreement written down does not prevent that person from acting independently of it, meaning from consulting somebody else, making a particular decision on their own. It's not a limiting document, even if you write down this agreement, like a guardianship would be. And importantly, supporters on a supported decision-making plan don't have access to personal information like medical information, records, things like that, unless they are separately given permission to access that information or provided that information by the individual. A supported decision-making agreement doesn't impact or infringe on a power of attorney or healthcare agent, though. So what that means is if you have this supported decision-making agreement, your supporters are available to you. Other people are also available to you to weigh in. And if you want to make a decision, you don't need to consult every supporter on your list or only the supporters on your list. But if you also want to consult with that group about certain things, but you also want to have a healthcare agent or a power of attorney dealing with your other financial considerations or your healthcare decisions, you can still designate that person. You can still use that other legal alternative at the same time as you use a supported decision-making agreement. So in Maryland, a person can select an individual or a team to help them think through, decide, communicate, and effectuate their decisions. They can choose both the type of decisions they want support with and the type of support they need. And so what I mean by that is many times individuals will say, I go to my mom for healthcare concerns, and I will consult with her by texting, speaking in person, and video calls if need be. I'll also consult with my uncle on financial decisions or housing, things like that. And I'll consult with him by these means. When I want to make a decision about a social trip, I will consult with friends, parents, siblings, and they can kind of outline it in that way. The supporters can ask questions, listen, provide advice, translate, and respect the person's decision. So what I mean by translate is individuals, and when we're talking about capacity, decision-making should not be limited or questioned because of a person's communication style. So if a person is using text to speech, or if a person is using assistive technology or spelling things out on a board of letters, their decision might need translated but it's still their decision. And as I said, supported decision-making can happen with or without agreement. But if you make an agreement, there's specific rules about, it would need to be a written agreement, and the different factors that it needs to include and how it works. A person under a guardianship can also enter a supported decision-making agreement if it doesn't impact the guardian's authority. A guardian would need to get a copy though. As I said, an agreement for supported decision-making does not impact the authority of a power of attorney or a healthcare agent. That is a separate legal process. And as I was explaining previously, the person can select their supporters, the type of support they want them to provide, and on what issues. So they can assign or select a reporter to help them gather information. Maybe their sister's very good at researching. They can have someone help them understand and interpret information. Maybe their parent is really good at, communicating information to them. They can have someone help them weigh the options, understand the consequences. They can involve people to participate with them in conversations, such as for note-taking, for help with translation, just for support, moral support. And they can have someone help provide them support and advocacy in getting their decision implemented. Supported decision-making agreements in Maryland can't be required in order to participate in any program, activity, or service. A supporter needs to keep records about what they are doing and how the adult is communicating and expressing their opinions with them. And unless the individual objects, their supporter should give a copy of the agreement to the individual's power of attorney, advance directive, or trustee. I want to make an important note. I mentioned on the last slide that a supporter can help advocate for decisions and help the person effectuate them. They can't enforce their decisions. A person can choose anyone to be their supporter as long as it is not a minor, someone who they have a peace or protective order against, or a person who's been convicted of financial exploitation. The document needs to be, if it's written, it needs to be in writing, or if it's formal, it needs to be in writing and dated. It needs to describe the assistance that each supporter can provide, how the supporters can work together, how any conflict of interest, whether it's actual or just perceived, could be mitigated, and how the adult the adult with the disability chose that supporter to assist them. The formal agreement must state that the supporter can't make decisions for the adult and that it doesn't override the authority of a power of attorney or an advance directive. It has to be signed and witnessed by two adults who aren't supporters or employees or agents of the supporters. And a person with a disability can revoke or modify their agreement at any time and can have support in the process of revoking or modifying it. It also provides a limitation from liability for third parties who rely on it. And what I want to emphasize here is that the agreement can be formal, and if it's formal, then it needs to meet these rules, or it can be informal. You can have supported decision-making without writing down an agreement. But if you are going to write an agreement, in order for it to be effective, it needs to have all of these categories. So thinking about supporters, a good supporter understands their role and doesn't try to influence or make decisions for the adult, knows how the person communicates and redirects others who are trying to speak to the supporter instead of the adult. So if, for example, an individual is using an assistive technology or is using speech to text, and a parent is helping to interpret for them, the parent, if someone is speaking directly to them as if they are actually the decision maker, as a good supporter, would need to refer the individual communicating to communicate with the person with the disability and really emphasize that the decision is coming from the person channeled through the parent as translator or assistant, but is at the end of the day, the decision of the person. A good supporter will consult with a person about how they want to be supported, and they will acknowledge when they might not be the right person to help with decisions. For example, if they don't have expertise in a particular area, they can be a good supporter by letting the person know that, by possibly suggesting someone who might be a better resource, and by not trying to give support where they're not best able to help. A good supporter will talk to the person about what's important to them, will not make value judgments about the decisions, and will check in with the adult to make sure they feel in control of the process and that they feel they are truly able to be supported and to make their decisions. And the last point here, a good supporter will recognize this point that I've been stressing throughout this presentation, that we all use support to make our own decisions, and keeping that in mind can be really helpful in the supported decision-making process. So some tools that a supporter could use are plain language materials, either visual or audio, advocacy for the person to have extra time in discussing or making choices. They can help with a list of pros and cons about a decision. They can take notes, as I've said, if the person gives them permission, in order to help the individual remember and reflect back on discussions and discuss their options later. And they can use person-centered and driven tools. So this was one of the other alternatives I mentioned. Person-centered planning has relationship maps or profiles. There are different programs that look at what a person's goals are, the steps needed to get to those goals, the different supports they have in different areas of their life. And those can be helpful tools in supporting a person in making decisions and supporting them in designing their plan for a successful life. Why is supported decision-making important? So over 20 states have either passed or are working on legislation for supported decision-making. Various state courts have terminated guardianships in favor of supported decision-making. And the US Department of Health and Human Services Administration on Community Living funds a National Resource Center for Supported Decision-Making that has funded pilot projects. And the reason for this support and this movement is that, and sorry, this slide just has another list of organizations. People with disabilities are regularly subject to unnecessary and overbroad guardianships, often based on bias. Again, I mentioned this at the beginning of the presentation. There is this perception, or there has long been a perception, that because a person with a disability needs support in making a decision or communicating their decision, that they are therefore unable to make it. And supported decision-making recognizes that at the end of the day, we all need support in making a decision. We all rely on that support, and using that support doesn't make the decision any less ours, or in any way mean we lack capacity to make a decision. It just makes us human. It just makes us individuals who rely on our community of supports in order to live our best lives. Supported decision-making respects people's voices and their choices, regardless of how they communicate and regardless of what their diagnosis is. It helps them develop advocacy skills, self-determination, and decision-making skills. And it keeps the person in the driver's seat of their life and allows them to keep their rights. Studies have shown that when individuals are denied the opportunity for self-determination, they have worse life outcomes. They've showed that an overbroad guardianship can have a negative impact on physical and mental health, longevity, ability to function, and reports of how people perceive their own well-being. Individuals who are under overbroad guardianships can have low self-esteem, passivity, and feelings of inadequacy and incompetence. And that makes sense, right? If you feel like someone else is making all of the decisions about your life, you might feel disconnected from it and have less interest in engaging, particularly if you feel on your own that you are capable of making a decision and your interests aren't being taken into account, and you're sort of being told what decisions have been made for you. On the other hand, people who are able to exercise self-determination through, for example, supported decision-making, have improved life outcomes. They're more likely to live independently. They can work in the community at a higher paying job and can have advancement in employment. They can be more likely to identify situations where they might be susceptible to abuse. They can have better financial independence, more community integration, and they have more perceived control over their life because of their ability to make decisions. So involving a person in decisions about their health, where they're living, who they're living with, can help them feel more connected and more invested in living that life that they want. And again, something to stress here is thinking about how we all make our decisions and how important it is to us to make decisions about what we eat, what our hair looks like, what we wear, where we live, who we spend our time with or live with, where we work or what we watch, what we listen to, what we read, what type of fitness routine we engage in, and what type of snacks we have. And thinking back to the fact that if a person doesn't have the ability to make certain decisions for themselves, it can lead to worse life outcomes in the long term. And by empowering people to make decisions when possible, we can help improve their quality of life. So these slides have several resources. I can make this presentation available afterwards so that these links are accessible to folks. There are several videos available that explain different supported decision-making. There's also one in the PowerPoint, but I passed over it. I wanted to be cognizant of time. There are videos where individuals explain how they use supported decision-making or how they feel supported using that process. And then, as I mentioned, this presentation wasn't specific legal advice, but if you do want specific legal advice or to speak to an attorney, you can call us on our intake line and request assistance. And I know this presentation is being translated to Spanish. We do have Spanish-speaking intake staff, and we also have the ability to get interpretation if folks need translation in a different language. So I know I've been speaking pretty quickly and for a long time. I want to see if there are any questions in the last few minutes before this presentation ends. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions. Oh, thank you, Ms. Parrott. I forgot about the survey link. Do you want to give the survey blurb?
Yes, we've put a survey link into the chat. If you could please take a moment to fill that out. And I believe there are someone typed in a few questions.
Mm-hmm. Do folks have the ability to unmute, Ms. Parrott?
I don't know about that, but if they could put their questions in the chat.
Yes, could you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. I am Grace, and I would like to, I have a son who is in the middle school, 7th grade. And as we are working on transition, I have a few questions here for you. The first one is to know the legal age. What's the legal age to be above him to represent himself, you know, to take responsibility and to have the legal capacity?
So in order to have legal capacity for himself, in general, the age is 18. But for special education in Maryland, it can go as high as 21, where the parent still has the ability to assist with educational decision-making. So in general, individuals with disabilities, just like anybody else, can, in the eyes of the law, receive that legal capacity for decision-making at age 18. However, I know you mentioned he's in middle school and you're going through the transition process with him now. He can be involved in the decision-making process, as any student can be, at any point. And I like to encourage my clients, especially middle school and high school clients, to get involved in their process, to start practicing those self-advocacy skills and skills to understand their supports and their needs at an earlier age, to better prepare them for when they do reach adulthood.
Okay. So like, I know it's a 14. When you are 8, that's where you start, or could you do it earlier, even when he is 12?
The official transition process, you mean?
Yes.
So transition planning has to start at age 14, but it can start earlier. And students can be included at any point. They can be included in their IEP meetings or 504 meetings and share their interests, and including interests about transition and interests about what they want to do after school at any age.
Is it something that you can request aside of the IEP process?
At age 14, it is a part of the IEP process. Before age 14, the IEP team can consider it as they're making other goals, but it's not required to be part of the process.
Okay, so it's something the parent can suggest, but they are not required. They don't have to accept it if they don't. The school
Right.
team.
Before age 14, right?
Before age 14, right. The next question is about power of attorney. So is the power of attorney given from the parent or the guardian to another person who is not related to the family?
That depends on the individual circumstances. And that's a legal process that's available to anyone with or without disabilities. That just requires making an appointment of the person to make that decision.
Okay. And I hope it's the last question here. It's about the quality control of the supporters. You know, because of the disability, especially if it is severe, in the process, how do you make sure that the voice of the person with the disability is not lost? Because you mentioned, for example, bias and translation of these needs. Like, we want to make sure that it's faithfully and completely translated. So to empower, all of that is to empower the person. And like you say, again, it's not just because it is disabled. Everybody, even us, even other who are typical, we all need to rely on a whole support system to make a decision. And we want to make sure that when those people we rely, make sure that people we rely on are reliable, and it helps us to make effective decisions that empower us, that make us think that, understand that it comes from us, right? So how do you, even just with people who are typical, it's harder. How harder could it be from a standpoint of the person who has problem communicating, right? Like we use like text.
Yeah, I would say.
How do you do that? How do you ensure a quality control from the beginning till the end and even after?
I would say that would be a good reason to use a formal written plan for supported decision-making, because the formal plan needs to have information about, and I can try and flip back. Apologies to everyone who sees these slides flying by. Here we go. It needs to describe the type of assistance each supporter can provide, and how conflict of interest can be mitigated. And it needs to say that supporters won't make decisions for the adult, and be signed. And so that can be a way of making it clear from the beginning of the supported decision-making relationship exactly which decisions supporters are providing assistance with, if there's a conflict of interest, so a disagreement between the supporter and the individual, or a reason that the supporter might be biased about a particular decision, it needs to say that. And if there's a concern that a particular individual, if the individual is concerned that one of their supporters might not faithfully or accurately translate or express their interests, they can designate that they won't be relying on that supporter for that purpose. That won't be the person they take with them for advocacy or translation. And they can revoke or modify the agreement at any time. So if they start this supported decision-making relationship with an individual and realize that that individual is not functioning as a support person, but is more trying to function as a substitute decision maker, they can modify the agreement in order to make it clear that that person doesn't have that authority anymore. I know, I'm sorry, I see we have to wrap up. I want to very quickly note that I did see a question about the process to go from guardianship to supported decision making. That process would involve the court that's monitoring the guardianship for that person. And you can contact, I will quickly go back to the last slide with our number, and you can contact Disability Rights Maryland for more information. I apologize that I wasn't able to share more in depth about that today.
I want to thank Ms. Jones for presenting this morning. We are out of time, and I appreciate folks asking those questions. We want to give folks an opportunity to be able to transition to the other sessions. I know you were rushed to try to cram in that response. Is there anything else you want to say about that last question, Megan, before you go? I didn't want to rush you too much.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Folks, if you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to us if you want any additional information, and I will share this presentation to Ms. Parrott and she can disperse it however. I saw a question about whether it'll be on the website, but I'll make sure that Ms. Parrott gets a copy and then you all should have access to it.